Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in gaming, how they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg, and with me as ever is Mark.
Hello, everyone.
And today, we have been absent for a little bit because we were trying to figure out my work schedule changed and life's weird sometimes, But we're back, and doing an episode I'm quite excited about. We'll be talking about, in short, we're going to call them game-breaking mechanics, alternate game modes, perhaps. You might know them as cheats. That long dead system of gaming that peaked probably in the early 2000s. What happened to cheats, where they went, why they were a thing in the first place. I think it was a fascinating story thinking about the narrative of gaming and how cheats changed along with what gaming was doing.
Yeah, this is such an interesting discussion, I think, because it's something that used to just be core to games. Core is a little bit strong, but most games had some form of cheat. I remember buying books. This was one of the areas of games I was most interested in as a child, was the cheats and the codes, and it's basically just gone.
Yeah, I mean it's a interesting thing, I think, especially for our generation. I think we grew up kind of in the heat of it. So we'll start just with, we'll get into some of the more abstract notions of what cheats are and the reasons that they existed and all that jazz. But for starters, I'll just give a brief overview of the narrative, as we tend to do. So to start, so cheats used to be something that were obviously not published at all. I mean, think like arcade, obviously going back to the arcade days. Complete word of mouth thing. It was a similar thing, right? Where there's the one cool kid who could beat Mortal Kombat and knew how to unlock the green, unlock Reptile, the green shader, the alternate shader of Scorpion. And that was the only way that was going to happen, was knowing someone who knew about it. And it was usually put into games. Now, these tended to also be, as a whole, they were less game-breaking and more kind of like Easter eggs sort of thing. That the developers had hid or put into the game. This was more, I think, just a creative choice on the developers' parts, particularly because we had no internet, right? We had no way to actually communicating about this. So when someone found it, it was a really cool thing. And that really plays into that kind of culture of the arcade era. Then move into home console games, and you see, for a little bit there, there's even I don't know if you remember Game Sharks, from Nintendo, that were these. You actually had to buy an extra piece of hardware that would allow you to enter all these cheats into the games. And at this point, cheats have become far more game breaking in terms of they'll be altering the content of the game as opposed to a big head mode sort of thing.
Right.
Stuff like GoldenEye was a classic one. If you got a Game Shark for GoldenEye, there are all kinds of different things you could do. You could have unlimited ammo, obviously the big head mode. You could put all the guns. You could unlock all the levels. You could make yourself invincible. You could give yourself, crap. This is such horrible thing for my gaming cred right now, but tiny guy with a hat.
Odd job.
Odd job, thank you. God almighty. I was thinking Kung Lao combat because I was still in Mortal Kombat. Yeah, same hat. Okay, if it makes anyone feel any better, he's got a razor hat. If you want to see Odd Job rated R, then go see some Kung Lao Mortal Kombat gameplay. Anyway, point is, so then we have this stage where it's and as well as you'll actually see it being sold in terms of strategy guides, right, and books. They'll have a cheat section in the back, maybe. Or I think in computer games, this was kind of the era where you would have in the chat, you could just enter codes in the chat, right? If you type something out, like Age of Empires did this, any RTS did this, basically.
Yeah.
Warcraft did this, Starcraft did this, where usually there'll be in-jokes even from the developers. The cheats themselves were usually pretty funny or weird. Kinds of different ways that you could manipulate the game, and this is actually the beginnings of, in my opinion, modding. Actually, the developer-sponsored modding, where the cheats give you different tools to change the game in a way that you'd want to play it differently. It's not just making you better or worse necessarily; it's unlocking other options.
Right.
It's unlocking. Even I remember there was some cheats in Age of Mythology that would give you unlimited. There's one to give you unlimited resources. There's one that would give you plus 500 stone, plus 500 food, plus 500 wood.
And a lot of times, these cheats or these modes were in the game to make things a bit easier And I think one of the reasons that started off, because when you think about it, there's no really reason to have cheats make the game harder or easier. They seem kind of arbitrary. But
Right.
I think for testing purposes by developers, they had already put in this logic. And so it was really easy to just sort of let the players have access to it because the developers needed to, they can't wait to go play an entire legit match of Age of Empires every time they want to test the end state of the game, for example. So it's much easier if they just immediately give themselves like a billion resources, build the best unit, and then go stomp their opponent and make sure the end screen shows up.
Exactly. That's like I said. I think it's developer. I mean, it's basically mod. It was a light version of mods where the devs were just putting in the tools that they had used, along with some of the other stuff. Like I said, some of the goofy stuff, some of the like game breaking stuff.
Right.
Large part it was just like game manipulation, particularly on PCs, like I'm thinking of right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then you move where like cheats have become a thing, and this is very early internet era. These are pretty close to each other, and I'm sure there's overlap between these. It's just an ad hoc, kind of overview for me, where you have games that have like cheats have become a thing, and you'll actually have like a cheat menu somewhere in the game. If you go into options, sometimes it'd even be on the main menu along with like single player, multiplayer, all that, and then you have cheats at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Where the cheats are games. Sometimes I'm thinking like Lord of the Rings, the licensed game from EA in 2002, had when you beat the game, it would show you all the cheats, and then you could enter them. Or this would you'd have a cheat mode, right, where you turn on a cheat mode. At this point, it really is less about finding these things organically and more about taking advantage of the internet, because these cheats tended to be, like you'd have to turn on cheat mode, or you'd have a long, 12-digit code or word or catchphrase or whatever that you'd have to put in. Less about, being able to like find that organically. No, you have to be given that, and you have to search for it, and the internet exists for that reason now. Or we put it in the game, you do it there.
Well, and even before the internet, I would say that in some ways these systems were designed to drive the sales of people who made guides to the games and people who made cheat code books. Because, if you're presented a cheat menu that has the potential for entering, let's say, 10 characters of any letter in the alphabet, how in the world are you going to, go through that search space and figure out what the valid cheats are? You're not just going to, sit there and type in random letters till you find one that works. You're going to need to have inside knowledge of the game somehow.
I do remember doing that. I forget which game it was, but it was one of those. Most of the time, actually, those cheats of phrases, but there was one of them I remember was just legit random characters. I remember sitting there. God, I must have been a bored kid. And putting in. I eventually got, but it would also sometimes not tell you what you unlocked. It would just make a noise, to tell you that you unlocked something or done something correctly. So anyway, these cheats also you'd have a combination of the previous ones, but you'd also begin to see creeping in here the ability to unlock things that you would normally unlock by playing the game. Thing like old Need for Speed games, unlocking all the fastest cars that would be behind very, very difficult challenges that were still within the game. It wasn't it was just you were jumping ahead. I used these in RTSs to get through the story mode sometimes because I didn't want to play through the whole game. I just wanted to see the story, so I just turned on God mode where all my units killed all the other units with one hit, and mine were invincible, and I'd win every mission.
Right.
But I still wanted to aim. I didn't want to there was another code to just win the whole mission, just immediately take you to the victory screen, but that was the point. I didn't want to. We'll get to that in a second. I actually wanted to play the game, but without any challenge to it.
Well, I think it's worth noting right here that cheats and unlockables have a very interesting relationship, because unlockables are the thing that lend themselves the best to cheats, in my opinion. But anyway, we'll talk about that later.
And that was another point I was going to say. Another example from this era would be Jak 2, where you had a in-game collectible items, that's just the collectibles for the game, precursor orbs, and you could spend those upon cheats. You had a choice between them. You could save up to get unlimited ammo. You could get a less expensive big head mode. You could reverse the game, in a mirror. That was a weird one that was pretty common back then too. Simple one. I don't really know why anyone put that in. There was a level select, actually, that allowed you to go back because the game was linear. And once you beat the game, you couldn't go back and replay your other missions. And so you could unlock the ability to go back and replay your missions with your gear. If it sounds like New Game Plus, you're paying attention. And so on and so forth. So that was kind of that era where we're in this far more games, cheats are part of the game. They're an established part of the game. They're understood. They actually have some DNA in the game. And then, honestly, I feel like a big part is you hit multiplayer internet era where that explodes, and suddenly you can't use cheats anymore, right? Because you can't cheat in multiplayer and have a robust multiplayer scene. Doesn't work.
Nope.
And I feel like that's kind of the beginning, as well as just the ubiquitousness of the internet, as well as going into a modding era where part of being connected via the internet so easily is that suddenly all these things that were previously cheats can be done by almost anyone via mods. And then that kind of takes us into, honestly, that in my opinion is what killed cheats off, was the online supremacy, and the fact that word of mouth died out and had to die out because the internet was just everywhere. And then the fact that these things that used to be cheats, like we talked about in the RTSs, like kind of these mod tools, so think about like the classic example Mark and I came up with was Skyrim, but one of our favorite videos is Video Game Donkey. He's a YouTuber, very funny. His Ultimate Skyrim, which is he just showcases all the weirdest, dumbest mods in Skyrim. But the point is, if you were to watch that game like 15 years ago, or that video, you'd assume, not knowing anything about like modding, you'd assume that those were just the cheats. They seem like things that cheats would be, in terms of like turning the dragon into Thomas the Tank Engine. Totally something that a cheat would be. What time is it? Oh, it's noon. Okay. If you can hear a siren, it's the tornado warning. Don't worry. It's the test of the tornado warning system. Anyway, okay, so that was the brief overview. There's a lot of things we're going to go back into there that we're kind of hitting on, because there's a lot. I've been using the phrase cheats just kind of generally. There's some differentiation to make there as well as we get into it. But what you want to talk about the core kind of problem with cheats, or the way that the difficulty therein with them, in terms of what breaking a game does to a game?
If you think about what cheats are, they're basically a way to break the game in a controlled way, right? To modify or nudge a rule in a specific direction. And it's funny because we actually talked about this last episode when we were talking about play, and just the importance of rule discovery in play. And so when somebody sells you a game, they've already come up with the right rules for that game generally. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be fun, and people just wouldn't buy the game. So it is kind of contradictory to then turn around and give the players a chance to tweak those rules, but I think it can give you some really interesting variants of games if you're careful. If you tweak the game a little bit and it still retains some of its challenge and the game loop to a sufficient degree, then you could have a new variant. If you really tweak the game, you might even have a new game, in the case of, like, talk about the transition from Warcraft 3 to Dota. But what more often happens when you tweak a major mechanic of the game is that it just stops being fun, and you basically have just broken the game. Think about God mode in a fighting game. It's like, okay, well, there's literally almost no game here, because the story is really minimal, and the whole point is just to not die. Or like survival horror, right? Can you imagine turning God mode on a survival horror? You've completely destroyed the experience.
I mean, for me, it would be really nice after, like, if we had played Outlast for an hour the way we did, and then turned on God mode, and I could go back through and just mess up all the things that scared me. That would have been great. But obviously, that's not what we're talking about. But you're entirely right? That in terms of removing these things that actually, by definition, make these games, you begin running into some problems pretty darn quick. And I actually even remember this as a kid, where I'd have to select which cheats I really want. Like I was mentioning the God mode in RTS games, where you kill all your units are invincible, and they all do like 1,000,000% damage, so everything dies in one hit. And in RTS, that is completely, you've removed everything about the game that makes the game, except for basically the city building aspect of it. You just make combat completely in not insurmountable, the opposite of that, inconsequential. Here we go.
Right.
And that actually gets old after a while. It's not fun to play the game that way. If I were just like load up a skirmish map and do that, that's not fun, right? There's no point in doing that. I did that for the story modes, so I could like see all the story stuff.
But it's interesting to think about how that particular cheat would play out versus another person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's sad to me that cheats in multiplayer are so rare, because I think that's you can get some of the most interesting game variants when you make things, overpowered or broken, but in the same way for both people.
Yeah,
And
that's just like you said,
human
it's just a new.
creativity can take over and figure out, okay, how do we turn this into a game? We both can kill each other in like one hit, so like, how do we still have fun with this?
Totally, it entirely changes all the rules, and it forces, and that's basically what we're talking about, like with emergent gameplay, right? That's the idea of like the true kind of sandbox fantasy of having all these different tools, all these different things that you can do to alter your world around you, not necessarily in a objectively better or worse way, but just different ways, and
Right.
then throw them all in with everyone, and rely on human ingenuity and creativity to create some really, really cool, fascinating things. And that's in the best sandboxes where you do enable your players with that. Like the Warcraft 3 one might be a bad example because the game was built around again, the DNA of the game, the gameplay loop was built around not being able to do that, right? There'd probably be one or two units you'd find really quick that were by far the best ones, the fastest ones with the longest range. And then you spam those basically, and whoever does that faster wins. The gameplay loop becomes pretty simple.
Right.
But sandbox where you have all of these different ways that you can, think, again, kind of go back to like EVE Online. It's easier to do these with MMOs, I think, for sure. But even with like, Melee, talking about Melee and it's the way its glitches work. There's so many different variants of the ways that all of those different characters can interact on different maps and different situations that it really lends itself well to people finding new ways to play. And so I think that is the really cool. I think that's a great point, Mark. Is that level of power that you have over the game allows new things to come out of it, and that's basically just morphed into the mod scene and why modding is so popular, and why some mods become their own games, why some mods become the accepted version of that game. That's actually true. A decent number of RTSs now that are old.
Mm-hmm.
They got modded and rebalanced by the community after official support ended, and now those are the definitive versions of the game. No one else plays the original releases. They'll play the Elite mod, they'll play, any number, like Dawn of War 2 is like this. I know a couple of Command & Conquers went this direction. So, in any case, that's an interesting, again, if you take that idea of the cheats as a tool to edit the game to its logical conclusion, that's where you end up.
Right.
I think you have to avoid entirely removing the experience of the game itself, like we were talking about.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as a potential downfall of like, yes, you give people more power over the game. The downside of that is not everybody is a game developer, and most ideas to change the game won't be good. Right?
Yeah.
Like most ways people come up with, like, this would be really fun. You actually play it for like 5 minutes, and then you're like, well, it was different, but once the novelty wore off, it was no longer fun. And that's really, we've talked about this before, but that's really the hard part about games, is making it so doing the same thing 100 times is still fun.
Yeah.
Because it's much harder than it sounds.
Oh my god, yeah. I mean, like I said, it's easy to talk about this, but I mean, even just think of doing any one of these things, right? Like we've talked about, like, okay, fine, make the game, and ultimately too, you have to imagine, like, think about those, like in RTSs again, the giving players the ability to edit things. The developers did all of that and still landed on the game that you got as the best version of that game that they could find, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. They started off with no constraints.
Exactly. So at some point you do have to trust the professionals
Mm-hmm.
of actually being able to, it is their, in fact, job to create this experience for you. And in large part, that's going to be usually and now there's other constraints, obviously. Time, creativity, and that's when you see games like big, huge open games like Skyrim took so well to modding because they did a really good job of building a world that you could just continually fill things with, and they just didn't have the time to keep on filling stuff. Now, to be fair, their DLC they put out was actually pretty good. You can never match the amount of time people on the internet have.
Or how many people are on the internet.
Yeah. That's a fascinating question, dude. Just like the globalization of the human consciousness, almost, to the point where suddenly you're now opening everything up to everyone. So limitations almost don't exist. But
Well, I want to avoid that fork for just a second and go back
yeah,
to the sandbox versus the theme park.
we are in
It struck me.
sounded like the apocalyptic there.
Let's not talk about how the internet is globalizing consciousness. Um,
Only in this
so,
podcast would we've gotten there semi-organically and accidentally.
yeah, that's true. Hegel would be proud.
Yeah. Anyway, all right.
Anyway, all right. So in sandboxes, it's interesting because so cheats are inherently the removal or potentially the addition of limitations. In sandboxes, limitations are local, and what I mean by that is the items in the game and usually the characters in the game have local constraints on them. Like this item can only, a wrench can only be used to turn bolts, right? It's just like in real life. You can't use a wrench to start a fire. It would be really weird to try and do that. So items in the game have local purposes and constraints, but there is no overarching purpose to the game. There's no grand narrative. And in that way, actually, sandbox games are kind of postmodern, because postmodernists don't like grand narratives. But anyway, in theme parks, there is a grand narrative. So in cheats for theme park games, you're talking about probably the cheats for theme park games are going to involve changing either local things, modifying local behavior, just like you would in a sandbox, or you can change sort of the overarching narrative, and that would be really game-breaking because the whole point of a theme park game is kind of get you to go through an experience. And sandboxes, they don't really lend themselves very well to cheats. Like, yeah, I guess you could make it so that like you have unlimited matches in your matchbox, or you can your motorcycle has unlimited fuel or never breaks down or something like that. But it doesn't lend itself as well to these sort of global cheats because the limitations aren't global. You can already do think about trying to add a cheat into Minecraft. Like, I guess you could make it so you can't die, but like dying in Minecraft is fairly inconsequential anyway. And so it doesn't lend itself well to these sort of game-breaking cheats. You already have so much freedom.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the thing with that too is like think about the limitations on a perfect sandbox, right, where the only limitations is your creativity of the player. Then like how do you remove that limitation? Like you can't touch that as a developer, right? Like you can't. I don't even know how you would simulate removing, like making a character more creative. Like I don't even know how to begin to touch that. That with theme park where it's far more goal driven and accomplishment based, that you can then give tools to accomplish those things or accomplish those things outright or yada yada yada. So there's I think it's a cool differentiation. Another one that was cool, we were talking about, I was thinking about the fact that I remember in that era of games in the like maybe early 2000s when cheats were far more widespread and you could unlock them, that very often I would prefer playing the base game over the cheat version, and only sometimes would there were basically two different games, right? If I would turn on some of the cheats, as well as it gave you a way as a player to like edit. I mean, yeah, like we've been talking about, like edit the game to your version of what you want the game to be, right? Like in case I'm thinking like Lord of the Rings, right? There was like God mode where you were invincible. There was super damage mode that you kill everything in 2 hits. There's other things like unlocking all of your moves at once, in terms of combos and stuff that boosted your, all of your, just gave you different options in combat. Or like giving you infinite ammo, ranged ammo, which was not game breaking necessarily because ranged wasn't that big part of the game. It just gave you a different way to approach problems. So anyway, all this, remember editing and playing with the cheats themselves to find like the ideal version of that game for me, because I didn't want to do the God mode thing, but sometimes I also didn't want to like, hey, if I messed up, I didn't want to die in this way this quickly. Like I remember actually one of them was it just would refill your health. It was a really quick one. It was down trying X. That was it. And so it was just like twitch that I could do on the controller, and I would use that tons because I want to be playing the game and feel like the risk of dying. But then if I didn't want to die, I was like, oh, that's stupid. I shouldn't have died there. Then I could just immediately bring myself back up. So it was kind of just a control thing. Anyway, point is, all that is to say, if you begin removing enough limitations and break enough rules, I was trying to figure out what a game became. And because I remember it wasn't fun eventually. And I think, Mark, you put it perfectly. It becomes a toy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about like what a toy is, or what. Oh, sorry, you cut out a bunch there. Sorry.
It sounded very deep to me at the moment. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, just like the what's that meme? The guy at the rave or whatever, staring up at the camera.
Oh yeah, sudden
clarity clearance.
Yeah, sudden. There we go. Sudden clarity clearance. Thank you.
Exactly. But yeah, if you think about like a very simple way to think of a game, and there are obviously much more complex formulations. See the last 40 some episodes of this podcast. But it's basically a toy plus rules, right? Like a soccer ball without the rules of soccer is just a ball. There's nothing in particular to do with it. It requires human creativity in order to make it something that is interesting to play with 12 people. It's not actually that obvious how you would take this single object and have it be fun for 12 people at the same time. But human creativity is amazing, and we actually have soccer.
Yep. Yeah, which is exactly, again, going back to, again, if you're paying attention, like, that's sandboxy, right? That sounds very sandboxy in terms of, hey, we have a ball, unlimited ability to figure out how to play with this ball, and we landed on soccer as being the most fun way to organize playing with a single ball, right? Like, I think it's fair to say across the world, soccer is by far the most widespread sport on the planet. So
yeah, I mean,
so right with Melee. That's how we decided that Melee should be what it is today. Rocket League, another good example. Dota, the MOBA scene.
Well, and this might be too much of a tangent to kind of go too deep into, but it's interesting to think about, like, cheats do let you strip away the artificial limitations, and what you're left instead with after you strip away all the artificial limitations is the toy aspect. You're left with the sort of inherent limitations, and then you can use the creativity from there in order to create a new game. So if you think about like the inherent limitation of a ball is like its size and shape and weight, right? You can't really change that and have it still be a ball. You could get a new ball, I guess, that's smaller. But in the same way, in a game, like if you strip away all the invisible walls and all of the rules, you're still left. There are still things in the game that have inherent properties that really can't be changed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's again, this is a tangent that we'll probably step on now, but like that would be it makes sense to me if for game designers that'd be a useful way to look at their games is like, okay, what are the how do we what are the tools? What are our baselines? What do we have? Like, what's our ball? And then how do you make it fun for 12 people to only have one ball? Like, how do you connect people? In the case of a game developer, it'd be like from the game to the player. But between them, how do you make this a thing between entities with this like one tiny tool set? And that's what game development is, and it's really hard.
Right. Because you have to come up with interesting balls, for lack of a better word. Like, interesting.
I was like, we're going to run any problems with this analogy.
You have to have interesting tools, right? And, like, here's an example. I'm reminded of the disc launcher from Tribes, because I played Tribes a lot. And it flies like a frisbee, like it shoots out of your gun like a disc, but also it creates an explosion, so you can use it like you could in Quake to use the rocket launcher. You could also use it to boost jump using this disc launcher. And so like that's an example of a pretty interesting tool, because not only can you damage your opponent, but you also can use it to give yourself increased mobility. And I was speaking with somebody about Team Fortress 2 the other day, and they were going on and on about how much they loved this game because almost all the weapons had like a dual purpose. Like they were talking about how the Pyro's Flamethrower created a small burst of energy and wind away, and you could use it to deflect projectiles because of the motion, the impulse of the flame jet could actually deter incoming objects. And like that's a fantastic example of a way to give a really deep mechanic through this tool sort of frame, where you take this, okay, we've got this flamethrower that does this pushback and it causes damage, and now how can players use that creatively? It's really fun.
Right. Oh, totally. And that's Overwatch, obviously being the major spiritual successor to Team Fortress 2, but that's what made me think of first too was various things like that in Overwatch in terms of, Mei's ice block, between healing her, putting an object that literally will block things within the realm. It removes her ability to move, but it also takes away on bad stats effects, as well as it can potentially isolate her.
Yeah,
So
and
anyway,
if you think about like the fair, I don't know if the Fair Mercy combo was intended by the developers to be like such a big thing, but it
right.
clearly is or was. I'm not that up to date on Overwatch, but um,
For a second, I'm pretty out of touch with Overwatch nowadays too. But um,
anyway, we should move back onto topic here. So we wanted
yeah.
to think about. So we've already talked about what cheats can do and the things they're very effective at removing. One of those would be unlockables, right? Like because it's literally just an artificial lock on an item or an area, and a cheat is just, well, you enter it, and then now the artificial lock is just gone. Like you have to kill 1,000 enemies before you can enter this area. Okay, well that's a really easy thing for a cheat to modify.
Right.
There are some things that do not lend themselves well at all to cheats. Greg, you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. We were thinking of particularly just types of games even that don't seem to fit too well with the idea of cheats. And in large part, it comes down to the DNA. I think we'll start actually this time with the conclusion. We kind of found that like if you the turning point between when cheats work and when they don't is when you if the cheats, and this shouldn't come as a surprise. I feel like we come to this conclusion often in various forms, but if you use cheats to modify or change or otherwise make more engaging or different the core gameplay loop that you have established in the game, it tends to work all right. If you remove the gameplay loop entirely from cheats, then that does not work. And the ones that happen, like, so the really easy example of that would be puzzle games, right? The point of the gameplay loop and the limiting factor is, in fact, your problem solving, your creativity. And the only way to bypass, and this isn't true entirely for all puzzle games, but think like adventure games specifically, where the only way you could possibly cheat with these would be by telling you what to do. Like, there's like hints that you could give, I suppose, and you could think about that. But in large part, a cheat, a way to make yourself better in the game, you have all the abilities you need. There's nothing else to unlock, and the core limitation is only you seeing the solution. It's binary almost.
Right.
And so to cheat that, you just completely remove the game, right? You remove the gameplay loop of having to figure something out. That actually, ironically, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. That's basically strategy guides. We basically sold that version of cheats for like adventure games or like story games or kind of platformer sort of things. Those are just strategy guides. But so story games run into a similar problem, right? Telltale games. I mean, you can have spoilers, I guess. But again, like when you think about the core gameplay loop of those games, it is primarily dialogue driven. It's primarily choice driven. It's meant to be branching. There's when you remove the goal in those games tends to be pretty darn fluid, and
Right.
it's difficult to hence remove things that are stopping you from getting that goal. Other than literally just like jumping through the game and looking at different cutscenes. You know, like if you just like, again, if you were to like give you the dev tools, then you could go see all the different choices you could make and how they respond. That's like the closest thing I could think of a cheat for those games.
Right. They don't lend themselves well to cheats, like literally. Like it's just hard to think of what you would do to cheat. But I also don't think they lend themselves well to cheats from like an audience standpoint. Like who in the world is going to buy Heavy Rain and then like just want to skip to the end? It's like buying a book and then reading the last page. It's like what in the world was the point of that?
Yeah. Oh, totally. As someone actually used to do that when I was a kid. That's a longer discussion actually, but that is a funny. I'd get so I'd usually get like halfway through the first act of a novel, and I get so stressed out that I had to go and read the end of the book just so I know how it end, and then I would go back and read through the rest of the book. So
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that is one potential use case for cheats in storied games.
Exactly.
I was playing Horizon Zero Dawn the other day, and it has a story mode which completely disables combat and the threats from enemies. And that was struck me as interesting because that, once upon a time, that would have been a cheat.
Totally.
And now it's just a game mode.
Right, now it's exactly, yeah. So, or just like they would have done that function, like the God mode cheats, where you one-hit kill everything and you're invincible. Like, it doesn't remove combat, it makes combat completely inconsequential. So it's the same thing. But now it is, in fact, like you said, a feature. It's a mode, which I think is fascinating. I think there's some level of that our discussion of modernism versus postmodernism, and then postmodernism has been a theme that we've come back to because it's so good, and I still think that is one of the best episodes we've done. Most credit goes to Mark for that one, but if you think about a postmodern game, there's really no place for cheats in those, right? Like, how do you when you deconstruct a game, how do you put cheats into that, right? That's the whole point. Like Goat Simulator, what's the point of that is to like think about how stupid the game is and what a game is and the glitches in it. It's not even polished. It's not the point. Postmodern games, usually the point isn't to win.
Right.
But then if you look at a postmodern game, like I'd argue Horizon Zero Dawn was, suddenly you see integration between the old modern version where you could like get around things via cheats, and then the postmodern version, in which the game is the cheat.
Right.
Suddenly you have this kind of melding where no, it's a mode, it's an option, it's a culmination, it's a combination.
Well,
Of the
and specifically with like Horizon Zero Dawn and that story mode, like we talked about how postmodern games are going to have a more narrative bent anyway, and you just can't cheat narratives. Like you can spoil narratives, which is what, people, that's kind of the closest thing that is the equivalent for movies to cheats, but you can't really cheat at them. You'd still have to go through the experience or at least know what happens in some way. And, cheats can't provide you with knowledge, right? So that's kind of the limitation. So I think inherently postmodern games resist cheats insofar as they're narratively driven, because you just can't cheat a narrative.
Yeah, I would say so those are like some games, particularly some series that don't lend themselves well to cheats, but it's interesting, there are ones that actually do seem to lend themselves well to cheats. Particularly our discussion, again, because this is a gaming podcast, we have to talk about Skyrim for a minimum of like 5 minutes per international gaming law. And but no, Skyrim was interesting. Particular, just RPGs, Elder Scrolls, big, huge, monstrous games like that. That they are designed. RPGs are at core designed that you will be increasing in power throughout the game, right? And that you will eventually be getting to the point, like I think with Skyrim, for example, right? If you upgrade everything fully in that game and get all of the most powerful armor and weapons, you are effective. Like, there's nothing left in the game that you can kill everything pretty much. Like, there's nothing, you can sneak through anything, you can do anything you want in the game, you can fool people, you can steal things, you can kill anything that you want, you can shoot anything like. Everything about the game becomes pretty much OP. It is effectively God mode, but that actually was just part of the game. The game was tuned to be so long and so big that they counted on people not doing that. In fact, you're not kind of supposed to play through the story mode for like kind of the 40-hour experience. I think you're supposed to be able to max out like a third of the skill tree, maybe. And then if you want to keep on playing, you can. So it's interesting that we see, like, similar to when we were talking about like Horizon Zero Dawn has a story mode. Like, it became part of the game. It got integrated. Like, normally, if those sorts of things that you can do at full level in Skyrim, like, particularly like some like the speech things or some of the sneak things at the very top tiers of the upgrade tree, would just be cheats in earlier games, I think. But now they just basically put it as part of the gameplay and the mechanic of this gigantic world that is pretty much limitless. If you do manage to max out this almost limitless world, then you do reach this standpoint. But there's no... As far as I know, there's no cheat. I mean, there's the modding community, obviously. But interesting, even in the base game of Skyrim, you had an effective God mode that was just finishing this gigantic game. And I think that's because games got bigger, and there were more resources, and there was more ability to put those things in. You could make them a goal as opposed to... Like, developers didn't have enough resources or time to be able to make a linearly, like, accessible tree that eventually ended you up in God mode for most games. That actually it was like a step-by-step process that eventually got you there. They just usually like had to give you the cheat and jump all the way up the power scale. But Skyrim was big enough that you could literally grow into that point. And
I think that's a great example too, because it's an example. It shows how cheats, or what would sort of be the equivalent of cheats, God mode, or just being kind of able to do and be anything, can be a giant carrot at the end of a really long journey, right?
Yeah,
Like, if you think about how long it would take for you to become the, max level in every skill in Skyrim, like that is a long journey. And
that's a
so
100 hour plus, I
you would
think.
want to reward players with a really big carrot for that. And so then they can literally do and be whatever they want. And so it becomes, instead of removing the fun from a game, it actually becomes the thing that people are working toward. Now, I would argue that once you get there, it's not that fun because you can kind of do anything in the game and there isn't much challenge left. But at that point, you've already sunk 120 hours, 200 hours into the game, and, maybe it's time to be done with the game.
Exactly. I was actually thinking of that too. Was that there's kind of the classic, the journey being the not the end point, but once you've gotten to that point in Skyrim, you've already done the game anyway, right? Like, what more do you want to? I mean, and that's kind of the point too. Of like I've talked about when you do have those God mode cheats, you put them in, it actually gets really old really fast.
Right.
You really only play it for a little bit. And so maybe that's appropriate in terms of when you get to that point. So finally, you can kind of do everything. You play around with it. You run your sandbox. You play with your toy for a little bit longer, but then you've pretty much reached the top of that game experience.
Well, I think one of the interesting things at play here is, like, yes, you're absolutely right, and that God mode ruins the game. And I think most people know that. And yet we sort of have this infinite capacity for self-deception in that regard, for thinking that it will be fun. And so you can use that in a game like Skyrim. You can actually leverage that self-delusion in order to motivate people to try and accomplish something that actually is not that great, which is being able to do and be anything in Skyrim. Like, that sounds really great, so I'm going to play through 120 hours of this content in order to become God, and then I get there and I'm like, well, this is boring. But I played the game for 120 hours, and like, what else could you want as a developer than for somebody to have experienced your game that thoroughly?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and seeing and really understanding all of the different systems in it to be able to get to that point, because it is still skill based. It's not just like, I mean, you can draw a similar parallel in MMOs where we've talked about that grind, right? Where the whole point is to get to the next level, so that you can get stronger, so you can defeat the enemy that'll give you the thing that gives you the next level, and then you get to max level, and then we have the whole end game discussion. Something has to be there, and so on and so forth. Like, it's just a forever kind of a carrot sort of thing. So I think maybe that's just an inherent problem with RPGs in general, or games that are based around growing in power, that tend to be, like that's pretty much RPGs. Is that the end of the road actually isn't the point? It is the journey.
Yes.
I'll just feel good about that for a second. And just remember, next time you're feeling stressed out in The Witcher, that
it's the journey.
This is the reason you're playing the game.
Well, I wanted to take a second and just sort of do a side-by-side comparison of modding and cheats. And we've been doing that throughout this episode, but just, I guess, more specifically. A cheat system is going to provide everybody a very accessible way to tweak the game, right? You don't have to do any sort of weird patching. You don't have to install an alternate launcher or anything like that. I
remember the mods. I used to have to go in and change registry items.
Yeah, you had to do some stuff that was like pretty low level in order to make the mods accessible.
Learning how to mod my games, actually.
And with cheat systems, you usually put in a code that's already built into the game's menu, and then the game changes. And so in that way, it's like super accessible. And as a developer, you really have control over how the game is going to break. And that might sound like a weird thing to want control over, but it gives people the feeling of like, I'm able to do, the naughty thing and like modify the game, but you're doing it in a way that is sort of fun. And as the player, they might not even realize like how carefully the developer selected what that cheat does so that it doesn't just completely become boring. Now, obviously, God mode is an exception to that because usually that does become boring. But, like big head mode in a lot of shooters, actually, Perfect Dark and GoldenEye both had those. But that's actually a really interesting, like when you think about it, way to change a shooter because, what is your weakest point? Oh, it's your head. So you've given all characters in the game a larger weak point, and so you've got to play differently as a result. So it actually tweaks the game slightly in a way that's still fun without completely breaking it.
Right, and you have to cover those things yourself. It's back to that kind of emergent loop again. It's like, okay, well, what now? How gigantic heads?
Right.
Find out.
It's not as good to be Oddjob when he has a giant head.
Exactly. Yeah. Kung Lao.
Well, and then when you think about mod systems, you can literally do anything. Like if you're playing Lord of the Rings game and you just happen to really hate how goblins look, you could literally make a mod to just remove all goblins from the game and then just leave everything else the same. But so it's really broad, but as a result, it's also a lot easier for you to kind of mess up the game in a way that you didn't realize was not going to be very fun at all.
Right, I think it's a cool example of what we were talking about a little bit earlier was that just the carefulness that once you get the toys and the tools to be able to begin tweaking stuff, and you see how even minuscule tweaks really steal out of the joy of the game. I think it is a good example of the expertise of devs. Honestly, I mean, we do rat on devs a lot. I'm hopefully not too much here, but we talk about like a lot of like problems and things that we would do differently or whatever. But at the same time, yeah, I think that's a great little like, hey, you want to see how well tuned a game is, change one thing about it and suddenly the whole game breaks down. Or here's this combination of things you think was really going to be fun. All right, we'll try it, it's actually not that fun. Sorry, like this is the funnest for it. Like, it's I think it speaks to, like I said, the difficulty of game development, but also certainly the level of these guys are in fact professionals. That's what they do for money.
And that's one of the reasons that actually, as a kid, I think I was so fascinated by mods because I aspired to be a game developer. When I was little, That's really what I wanted to do. And so I think cheats and mods were fun to me because I got to sort of stand on the shoulders of giants in that way. I got to take these games that had been developed by, a 7-person team of people working 40 hours a week, and I could, tweak it a little bit, and it would feel like I contributed to this amazing game.
Yeah, no, totally, and there's a sense of ownership there, and a sense of like creativity and completion on your part. Makes sense.
I think what you just said, sense of ownership in mods, pairs really nicely with the sense of mystery from cheats. So mods give the community a sense of ownership over the game. Cheats give the game a sense of mystery. And with the internet and the information age, that sort of mystery is extremely hard to sustain. You have to go way out of your way if you wanted something to actually seem mysterious. Even something as convoluted as Doki Doki Literature Club, with people were decoding files and they were MP4s, and it said a code in Navajo, and then they decoded it and they plugged it back into the game, and it was insane the steps that people went through.
Navajo, codes. We've repurposed World War II level security system. No, it's a great example. You're right. Think of the lengths that people have to go, and we talked about this in the horror episodes too, of how to maintain suspense and fear, particularly because it lives off that in games nowadays. It's just so hard, and that has become almost like a new part of the genre, is finding just the way to do that, as opposed to thinking up a new setting or something. That's not enough anymore. You have to be able to play into this way of keeping people within, suspense and surprise. And I think you're absolutely right in that regard, that it makes sense that cheats would not flourish in that ecosystem. They really can't.
And so I think what you've seen instead is a lot of things that would have been cheats have either been moved to just sort of a frankly unlockable thing in the game, or they've been modes that you can make in the game. Think about the Halo skulls. Those totally would have been cheats in an earlier game, but they were made collectibles in the game where you find these skulls and then you could turn them on. And
the interesting thing about that too is that, again, if this is the most cynical take on this, but if you go back to that narrative I was kind of writing, cheats and control of these things, basically getting into the guts of the game, became more and more common and less of a commodity, or more commodity. Eventually, devs potentially could have figured out that that was a way to be monetized as well, and what used to be cheats that were, things that you could unlock via the internet, or just a code, suddenly became a paywall. And Mark put on a good differentiation for I'm not even talking about loot boxes as much as buying cheats, basically. So think Shadow of War, being able to buy the most powerful of the orc bands just off the store, or being able to buy a really, really powerful put into your weapons. That's That's literally what we've been talking about, just with money involved. I tried to talk about Battlefront 2. If we do have a new whipping boy, hopefully it's Battlefront 2. What was our old one? Oh yeah, Diablo 3.
Diablo 3.
Well, let's anyway. We haven't talked about Diablo in a while, but Battlefront 2, Mark pointed out, was less some level of what I was talking about was a full game plus cheats, and Mark, you pointed out that they didn't even try to sell us a full game with Battlefield 2. So I can't even use so yeah, that again, even more cynically, you move from cheats to the actual game being behind a paywall, and that's where you end up in December of 2017. But
and I think that isn't like cheats are fun for people and things to aspire to, but when you start hiding what's fun about the core game loop behind arbitrary amounts of money or information, or just you privilege a certain group of people who are allowed to have fun to play the game and the rest of the people can't, that's when people get frustrated.
Oh yeah. And that's actually, to be fair, I'll go back to Shadow War for a second. That game wasn't actually as hated on. It was a bad timing because it was within probably the biggest uprising of anger I've seen in the gaming community in a while, and towards the end of 2017. But what you said about removing the core gameplay loop, the gameplay loop was intact. You actually could play that game entirely without any microtransactions, and they were not too all in your face about it. It was pretty easy to avoid them, and the game played just fine without it. According to all the reviews, I've played the game. I had a good friend who played 40 hours of it, said something similar. So that is an important thing, is that just the option in and of itself to do that isn't necessarily bad. It's when they tune the game to the point where you have to do that.
Right.
In order.
And I think there's this weird sort of like valley that you have to stay on the right side of this valley, basically, when you're adding in things that are unlockable. Because if the thing that's unlockable is super fun, like everybody's going to want that. And if you put that behind money, people are going to get mad. If the thing is kind of fun, like think about Overwatch skins. Like, they're kind of fun. They're not amazingly fun. It's not like there's people over there who are like, they're having a blast, and you're just sort of like sitting there playing a crappy game.
The normal original art is so damn good that's the point. You don't feel like, you don't feel like you're missing out too much because they just made the base game so freaking good by itself. All the original skins are insane. They're gorgeous.
Right, and that's exactly my point, is that like the skins are sort of fun, and so making those unlockable, even if they're really hard to unlock, is okay. But when you make something like playing as Darth Vader an unlockable through like incredible amounts of time, but it's like a blast because you get to run around as a Jedi and like slaughter people with your lightsaber, and there's all new mechanics, and only a certain very small group of people get to have that experience. That's where you get people who are pissed off.
It's been a while since I've thought about that. It's been like 6 months and all that jazz, and at the time there was so much hype and so much stuff around it that it was obviously all very, very intense. But in retrospect, saying those words it sounds like something out of The Onion. Like, that is the dumbest. Like, it's insane.
Yes, new Star Wars game allows you to use a lightsaber only after, putting 1 million hours in the game. Yeah, it does sound like an Onion article.
Yeah, that is the most. It's so painful. It's actually deeply, deeply painful in some ways that the industry got to the point where they're like, let's make a major Star Wars game and not let people play as Darth Vader. Anyway, that's just hit me afresh because I haven't thought about that in so long, and I'm like, oh my god,
they really did that.
I don't know what else to. That seemed like the best version of that joke, almost. Anyway,
so I think we can kind of wrap up here with just a reiteration of like, games are very hard to make and they're very finely tuned, and so being able to come up with cheats that are actually fun is also extremely hard. In some ways, it reminds me, in a theoretical sense, of how it ties into our discussion about sequels and how it's really hard to just tweak a game a little bit and still have it feel like the original game and still be fun.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've had all sorts of connections here. I remember. I'm just going to tell you a quick story. I guess this will just be story time at the end here because we've covered a lot, and I have some fond memories of. I played Majesty as a kid. which was it was a really interesting game. I don't know if any of you all played Majesty. I'm sure you can find it for free online now. But there are very specific cheats that you enter into a text box like in Age of Empire, and I actually had a lot of fun with that game using the cheats because the game, and it's basically because the game didn't play like I wanted it to play. I was used to RTSs where I told units where to go. In Majesty, you don't. You control the structure of the kingdom, and you can place bounties to incentivize your characters to go places, but they have their own free will, quote unquote. They do what they want. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to control the characters. And so the way that I had fun with this game that I otherwise probably would not have had that much fun playing was to use the cheats. And then by using the cheats, I could accomplish the same thing. Because I could come up with like unlimited amounts of money, placed ridiculous bounties, and just send people where I wanted them to go. And so then I actually had the control over the characters that I wanted. And that was way more fun to me than playing the base game. And so that's an example of like, I probably would not have spent very much time playing Majesty if I was just left with the vanilla rule set. But by using the mods, I was able to take a game that played very different than what I wanted and make it more of what I wanted.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the beauty of those tools, basically. I mean, similarly, I feel like I've done this for a long time. I think I talked about this on air, talking about the way I gimped myself. I put arbitrary limits on Shadows of Mordor. The second time I played it. To find the ideal version of the game for me. And in that case, that was just built in. I mean, that was more just a progression thing that I had to... This whole time we've been talking about unlocking as opposed to limiting your power, and in that case, that actually required it the other way around. But I was thinking about it. I'll just end on a story of my own with thinking about Ratchet and Clank, that series. I loved that series, at least the first three. It got I grew out of it by the time I had God of War at that point, and then it was all over. And... But the first three Ratchet and Clank games were fantastic. The super weapon at the end of each game was called the Rhino. They rip you a new one. RYNO is very, very edgy humor for a middle schooler and younger at that age. And it's classic early Insomniac. But I was so at the end of the first. I'll briefly describe to you what each one does. They're these stupidly expensive end game guns that again similar kind of like to Elder Scrolls. By the time you get these, you've already kind of mastered the game, so it's more just kind of to play with for fun. But each one did something different. So the first one was just it shot this cloud of rockets out, and they like probably 20 rockets out, and they all did tons of damage, and they all kind of homed in on different enemies. So you fire it and it'd all go out, and that was really fun because in large part. It was a fire and forget weapon, but the core gameplay of Ratchet and Clank was running around. It was platforming plus guns and weird guns. That was the whole point. So there's a lot of motion. There's a lot of dodging enemy attacks. There's a lot of getting around to the point where you could fire your weapon safely, all that jazz. So the first Rhino was not too bad at that. It was super, super powerful, but you fired it. You pointed in the right direction. You had to be in the right area. You saw dodge enemy weapons, but once you fired it, a lot of stuff in front of you would die. And it felt pretty darn good, and you could fire it off pretty quickly. The second one, I think, was my favorite. It was basically a rocket launcher Gatling gun. Super inaccurate, but it was a rapid-fire rocket launcher, and the rockets, each one, you could hold it down or fire them individually, and they were just super, super powerful. And I think that was the most fun one, because it felt really, if you just held it down, everything inside it, in front of you just died and exploded, and, or you could be more precise with it, right? And so it was just a blast. It felt ridiculous and overpowered and over the top, and allowed you to really engage in, again, that core gameplay element of running around and blowing things up. That was, you had to do that, and it was a very active thing, too. It was very fun. You had to select certain targets, and like I said, there's some directional component to it still, and so I think that was the best one. Now, the third one was interesting, in that they, at first it was similar to the first two, but eventually in that one you can level guns up, and when you level it all the way up, it stopped being a kind of rocket launcher, and what it would do would fire off all these little rockets like 5 feet in front of you, and then they would combine into one, and the screen would flash white, and everything on your screen would die. And that was it. And I remember actually hating that one, because it completely eliminated any part of what made the game fun. If the earlier Rhinos had encouraged and really unleashed what made the core gameplay of Ratchet and Clank fun, which was moving around and blowing things up and allowing you to do that in a really over-the-top fun way, the Rhino 3, the Rhinonator, as it were, it completely eliminated that. You literally didn't have to You actually just had to press R1, and everything on your screen died, and then you could like go to the next area, and that was it. So I actually trying to avoid letting the Rhinonator level up and being sad when I eventually would do it. So I think that just as a final note of like the way that cheats or god modes or game breaking things, the game was broken in some ways with the early Rhinos. You no longer scared of anything. You could kill everything. Like you weren't going to lose, but you still got to play the game. With Nader, it pretty much eliminated the game. Not only did it blow up the screen, it blew up the game.
That's fantastic.
That's usually the equivalent. Like you unlock a weapon, you press, and your PlayStation turns off, and you're like, all right, well.
You beat the game. You no longer have to play this game. That would be like a really interesting version of like a postmodern cheat. Anyway,
yeah.
we're at time here, so we should wrap up. But that's a fantastic story that illustrates what we've been talking about.
Like you can only the game disappears forever, and you only have an ebook. That would be
yeah, that would be a good postmodern cheat. That's funny.
That sums up.
Yes, that does sum up our cheat segment. Just to remind everybody, we are doing a fundraiser to get a PS4. If you would like to contribute to that, you can go to patreon.com/gamingmechanics. If you have thoughts about cheats or codes or glitches or mods,
or your favorite.
Yeah, or you just want to tell us a story about your favorite games and your mods with them, you can email us, mark@gamingmechanics.net, greg@gamingmechanics.net. That will go to us. And we will see you, hopefully next episode we'll record in person, actually, because I'm going to Michigan.
Woohoo!
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So we'll get to spend some time together. We'll probably play some games. We don't know what our next topic will be, but it probably will come out of our time together over the next week. So stay posted. Stay tuned. Stay around.
It'll be. I don't know if everyone remembers that really standout episode that we recorded together. I haven't been doing it. December, but you can expect more of that.
Okay, we're laughing because it wasn't actually any different for you guys. It was much more different for us. But
yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
Xander was like, "Yeah, it was a great episode. Pretty much wasn't any different though," and we were like, "Crap."
Next time we'll be playing instruments together live.
Yeah, there we go. All right.
If you email us the right code word, then we will play music together live. All right. Okay, bye guys.
See ya.